You look very crooked. Oh well, it is what it is. Thank you for tuning in to part 3 of this series that we have called Liturgy, gathering around the practice of non-duality. In the first talk of this series, we opened with some introductory comments and provided some definitions for churchy words like liturgy and mystical words like non-duality. And we talked about what my goal is for this series, like why I'm doing it to begin with. Mainly, I'm trying to sell people, if they are not sold already, on the importance of practicing one's spirituality in community with other people. Central to the Episcopal identity and ethos is our prayer book. We have a book called the Book of Common Prayer, and it's called the Book of Common Prayer for a reason, my friends. Praying with others is at the heart and center of who we are and what we're all about. We hold prayer in common, and we practice this common prayer together. Simply believing what we Episcopalians believe, that's not what makes you Episcopalian. There's many people who have reached out to me through this season because of our online stuff and said, yeah, I think I'm Episcopalian now, and have yet to darken the doors of an Episcopal church. You're not Episcopalian. If you're not participating in common prayer, it's great that you believe a lot of the same things that we do. It's just that's not what is central to our identity. Dogma is not what's central to our identity. Prayer is what is central to what we are all about. So praying with us and participating in our rich liturgical life, this is what makes you Episcopalian. And in my last lecture, I talked about the Eucharistic liturgy as a whole and its significance. Again, the word Eucharist means thanksgiving, and we talked about how practicing thanksgiving or gratefulness overcomes all duality in this present moment, more so than perhaps any other practice or spiritual method out there. This week, I want to zero in on two closely related but interconnected concepts whenever it comes to the Eucharistic liturgy. The themes of procession, or I should say processions, I guess, and sacred space. As we've mentioned before, liturgy is commonly defined as the work of the people. And it is my contention that the work of the people is the practice of non-duality, the practice of overcoming all dichotomy, division, duality, etc. In essence, the work of the people is the practice of oneness. I could have also titled this whole series, Liturgy, Gathering Around the Practice of Oneness, and that would have done the trick. I like non-duality better. I think it says more. But church, in my mind at least, is about uncovering and unwrapping the oneness that underlies everything, all reality. Through the liturgy, we discover our union with God, our union with each other, and our union with the whole cosmos. We discover, as St. Paul said, that in Christ we live and move and have our being. We also discover, as St. Paul also said, that there are neither male nor female, Jew or Gentile, slave or free, but all are one in Christ. In other words, all gender, national, racial, and economic barriers are overcome in and through Christ's presence in the liturgy. All that unites us in the Eucharist drowns out all of the cultural noise that so often divides people in our society. So again, this week we're going to look at how we practice overcoming the duality between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, between God's suffering and ours even, through the Eucharistic liturgy as we engage with the interrelated themes of sacred space and procession. So first, let's talk about sacred space, because we can't really make sense of all of the processional stuff or all of the movement in that space. We can't make sense of it until we grasp the significance of the sacred space itself. Many churches in our country, mainly because of the influence of evangelical Protestantism and all of its various offshoots and flavors, they no longer think about their worship spaces in a symbolic way. I don't hear them talking about that ever. And I spent a good deal of my journey in those circles. So the sanctuary is set up in such a way where it serves a functional purpose only. It's just a practical purpose. A couple of examples of what I'm talking about. If you were to go into pretty much any modern evangelical mega church, or any modern evangelical church that's trying to imitate mega churches, the sanctuary will probably feel more like an auditorium than a traditional sanctuary. And more than likely, there is either an elevated platform or stage at the front and center of everything, where the pastors and the praise bands and the fog machines do their thing. Forgive me for that one. These stages or platforms were designed only with function in mind. It's so that everybody in the audience can see everybody on the stage, just like at a rock concert. Maybe there is some symbolism here after all. But the elevation of a particular space in that sanctuary, it carries no other significance than that, other than people being able to see what's happening up front. It's also interesting to note that a lot of these spaces are lit a lot like a rock concert. The lights in these spaces are dimmed, and the only light is the spotlight illuminating the people on the stage. Sure, there might be a projector screen with PowerPoint, like song lyrics and Bible passages on it, but that is about it, generally speaking. But in traditional church design, the altar, which is the table where all of the bread and wine stuff goes down, if you're not familiar with altar lingo, right? It's where the Lord's Supper or Eucharist or communion, Mass, starts to take place, at least. But this altar area, it's elevated not mainly so that everybody in the pews can see it, although that's clearly an obvious bonus, right? But that's not the main focus. The main thing, it's elevated so that it can signify that this is the high point in the whole room. It is the Holy of Holies. And this is one of the reasons why candles are lit up by the altar. It's a way of not only drawing attention to the altar and sort of like beautifying the space, but the symbolism conveys to us this truth, that by meditating on the altar and the movement around it and upon it, you too will become enlightened. Your soul, your heart in a certain way will become like what the altar is. It will become enlightened. Meditate on the altar and you will see the light. If you're sitting in the pews, you are supposed to feel like the altar is elevated a bit above you. That in order to be illumined by its light, you either have to go up to it, or the reality of its light has to somehow come down to you. In other words, the altar area is a symbol of heaven. But also, very importantly, the space in which you are sitting in the pews represents earth, all of material reality. The entire room is meant to be a microcosm of the greater macrocosm that is heaven and earth. In other words, we are acknowledging that heaven and earth are both presenting themselves to us in this space simultaneously. That in this space there is no duality between heaven and earth, really, and that we are participating in both realities actually at the same time. And this is precisely why those who serve around the altar traditionally wear white vestments or robes and not just street clothes. It's not just about respecting the space, like trying to class yourself up or dress yourself up or whatever, to venerate the space. It's about embodying something in that space, becoming a walking, living, breathing symbol in that space. It's not as though these people who are serving at the altar wearing all white are better than anybody else or more holy than anybody else. It's because they are depicting a heavenly reality, whereas you in the pews are depicting an earthly reality. Two sides to the same coin are being presented to us in the space. And the heavenly reality is beautiful, and guess what? The earthly reality is beautiful. So all of this garb, this dress-up stuff, these vestments, these robes, it's not about elitism or elevating a few people above all of the other people. It's about ensuring that the fullness of reality itself, the whole package of our human existence, is being represented and expressed as we participate in this Eucharist together, this act of great thanksgiving. Now here's where things get really fun for me, where I really start to geek out, as if I hadn't already, right? The clergy also wear different colors according to the different liturgical seasons or feast days. I lost myself here. Clergy also wear different colors according to the different liturgical seasons and feast days. Now, I'm not going to unpack or break down how or why the different colors represent the different seasons or feast days, seasons like Lent, right? Advent, Christmas, Easter. I'm not going to break down how these different colors came to represent these specific seasons, like how the color red has come to represent Pentecost Sunday because red represents the fire of the Holy Spirit, apparently, or how red is the color worn on the feast days of martyrs because it represents the blood of the martyrs. I don't really care about that. Maybe I should admit that as a priest, but the color scheme is not what concerns me. Most people who care about this particular subject probably know enough about it already. I don't need to beat the dead horse on it. Again, for me, I want to dive even further into the mystery, the mystical insight symbolized by all of it, not just kind of like the shallow end of trying to figure out what colors go in certain places, right? So according to two very well-known Jewish authors who lived around the time of Jesus, Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, the ancient Hebrew temple also utilized an array of colors in its most sacred space, the Holy of Holies, which is like the center of the temple. This ancient temple was seen by the Hebrew people as a microcosm of the greater macrocosm that is the universe, all of existence. Does it sound familiar? I'm starting to repeat myself here. More importantly, it was seen as the place where God's presence dwelled. To the Hebrew mindset, the ancient Hebrew mindset, God did not live up there somewhere in a place far away called heaven, even though that space existed, the space beyond, the transcendent space, right? The great unknown, that was acknowledged. But for these people, God particularly dwelled, God's glory dwelled in the midst of the people, in the center of creation itself. Furthermore, because God was believed to be in the midst of the people, heaven also was believed to be in the midst of the people, in the center of all of reality, in the center of creation. Heaven was the very thing that united all of creation. It was like the golden thread woven all throughout the great tapestry of the world, of the universe even. The most sacred space inside of this temple, the Holy of Holies, it was heaven to people. This is where you went to go experience heaven in its most potent manifestation. And at the entrance of the Holy of Holies was a large veil or curtain, and it was woven with 4 different colors of thread. This is where things get a little wonky, but here it is. According to Philo and Josephus, these colors represented the 4 key elements that serve as the kind of mythic foundation for all of creation. So there's red color, red threads for fire, blue for sky, makes sense, right? White for land. According to one of these guys, I don't remember which one who said it, it was white for land because linen was made from the contents of land. And then the last color was purple for the sea because purple ink came from sea creatures. So I don't know how they put that together, but they did, right? Again, I don't want to wade in the shallow end and ask why or how purple came to represent the sea. I don't care. I don't think that's the significant point here. I actually want to swim out into the deep end. So venture out into the deep end with me, momentarily at least. This veil that represented the entire creation was the doorway into the Holy of Holies, the doorway into heaven. And the high priest had to pass through the curtain in order to enter that most sacred space. the high priest had to pass through the curtain in order to enter that most sacred space. Yes, let the significance of that movement hit you. The idea was that in order to get to heaven, the high priest didn't need to bypass the earth or material reality, didn't need to escape it. Rather, the high priest went through it. Heaven rests at the heart of earthly existence, not above or beyond it. Now, the high priest, significantly enough, also wore a robe made up of the exact same colors that the veil was composed of whenever he was out in public with the people. He was a visible representation of the fact that, again, heaven was in the midst of the people. Now, behind the various colors that we modern Episcopalian clergy folk wear is the same exact idea. The color scheme doesn't just represent different liturgical seasons like Easter or Advent, but the color scheme represents the entire universe itself, the thing that veils heaven in the midst of us. In other words, the universe is the priest's garment, and the deacons for that matter, and the bishops, I guess, too, right? We've got to throw the bishops in there as well. They're kind of important, I guess. We'll save the bishops for another episode, maybe, if I feel like it. It would be really fun to try to unpack the mystical symbolism of the bishop's mitre. I have sort of like inadvertently stumbled into moments of enlightenment and mystical ecstasy by meditating on such things as like the bread and the wine, or the symbolism of a sacred space, or a cross, in the sanctuary, or the processions during a service. But I'm not sure anybody has ever discovered union with the divine by meditating on the bishop's pointy hat. Anywho, I digress. Moving on. If you were to walk in and simply observe an average Sunday morning here at St. Paul's, for the majority of the service, you would see folks in the pews dressed how normal people dress. And you would see some altar servers up by the altar wearing white robes. The people in the pews, again, what do they represent? Earthly, physical reality. And the people up by the altar in the white, they represent heavenly, spiritual reality. Interesting note, but the clergy, they wear colorful vestments or garments over their white robes. And the altar also has a commixture of white and colorful cloth spread out upon it. In other words, the clergy and the altar represent both the heavenly and the earthly realities simultaneously. That whole non-duality thing, right? They represent the union between heaven and earth, the non-dual existence that heaven and earth share. In looking at them, you see that heaven and earth are two sides to the same coin, right? And whenever it's time to come up and receive the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, you leave your pew and you walk up to the rail that's just at the foot of the altar. Think about the movement. You are journeying from your seat into the heart of creation. You're going through the veil. You are journeying through earthly existence into heavenly existence when you come to that rail. And some people see the rail, the altar rail, as a barrier, right? Separating the people in the pews from the holy people up by the altar. It's rubbish. It's just dualistic thinking. It's not so. The altar rail is the connecting point, not the dividing point. It's the veil. Yeah. So as you're coming up to the rail, you will see this overlapping of heaven and earth being depicted to you through color, being depicted through the convergence of different spaces. You see that it's not just heaven that is represented by the space around the altar, but on the clergy and on the altar, heaven and earth are both being depicted in colorful ways, symbolic ways. Heaven is in earth, and earth is in heaven. So it's true. Simply meditating on something as cheesy as colors in church could bring you into enlightenment if you have all of this knowledge in your head, right? It could bring you to a state of non-dual consciousness. You can go beyond the symbol and into the reality. And the bread and the wine that is consecrated up on the altar in the center of the heavenly realm, it becomes one with your physical being whenever you partake of it. That which was consecrated in a heavenly space now dwells within you after you eat it. More on that later. That's a whole nother episode, right? But to conclude this section, I want to say that this isn't everything that could be said or should be said even about sacred space and all that is represented and even embodied in the sanctuary. But it's enough for now. It's enough for you to dive into the mystery if you choose to do so, if you choose to do the work of the people with the people in the liturgy. So let's move on. During a traditional Episcopal service, there are, generally speaking, 3 processions. I like to call them Jesus parades. And I wanted to talk to you about sacred space first because without understanding the basic symbolism of the space, we can't really understand the meaning behind all of the movement within the space. So at the beginning of the service, the altar party lines up at the back of the sanctuary, which is also usually the entrance to the church, if you're not familiar with kind of traditional church setup, right? That's at the beginning of the service. They line up at the back, behind where everybody is seated. And again, the altar party, they're all dressed in white robes because they're going to be serving up by the altar. And even though processions look different in every single church, here's what ours at St. Paul's looks like. There's one person, usually with the occasion of a few feast days, leading the whole parade. They are called a crucifer because they carry a big cross, a crucifix in. And beside or right behind this crucifer are 2 torchbearers, which is like the most misleading name of all time, because they aren't actually carrying torches, but just candles on big sticks, let down. When I got roped into being a torchbearer for the first time, I was stoked because I thought somebody was gonna hand me a torch that I can carry through the church building, but no, they just gave me a freaking candle. I guess candle bearer doesn't have the same ring to it, right? So they stuck with torchbearer. But these torches, these candles, are meant to illuminate the cross, the crucifix, just like how the candles by the altar are meant to illuminate the altar, to highlight the significance of it. Now, in other churches, larger than our own, sometimes a choir will walk in behind the crucifer and the 2 torchbearers. Sometimes, even if there's a preacher other than the priest or deacon, they will walk in as well behind the crucifer, torchbearers, and choir. And at the back of the parade, at the very end, where Santa Claus is on the Thanksgiving Day parade, right, comes the deacon and the priest. And the priest is always the last one in, unless the bishop also happens to be visiting that Sunday, which is pretty rare these days. And the altar party, they process in, they walk in, they do their parading thing, and they come in, and they take their place around the altar as the congregation sings the opening hymn or song. Now again, note the movement through the sacred space. The altar party processes from the space that symbolizes earthly physical reality, and they enter into the space that symbolizes heavenly spiritual reality. This may seem like an insignificant detail, but my friends, it's not. There's a reason why the altar party doesn't just start already seated up by the altar as the service begins. The movement, the choreography of it all conveys something deeply meaningful and mystical to us. That even though there is a duality in a way within the sanctuary, heaven and earth, the altar party passes through that duality. They move from earth to heaven in the first procession. Their movement overcomes the duality. Then at the gospel procession, which is the second Jesus parade, the altar party, the person with the big cross again, and the people with the tiny torches, They come down once again. They come away from the altar and down towards the people, and even to in the midst of where the people are sitting. And they stop with the deacon right in the center of everybody, of the community. And it's from that central place that the deacon reads, or better yet, proclaims the gospel. This gospel, which is carried down from heaven, lands in the center of the people. And this heavenly good news, which is what gospel means, the good news, it reverberates outward from the midst of the people, from the midst of the community, from the midst of the space that represents creation. Another way of saying it, heaven has come down and manifested itself in the midst of our earthly reality. The Word becomes flesh. Before the deacon even utters a single word of the gospel has already been proclaimed by the movement itself, before the procession even stops. After the gospel is proclaimed, the altar party and the deacon walk back up to their places around the altar. Then at the end of the service, the entire altar party processes out of the sanctuary, just like how they processed into it to begin with. And again, the congregation is singing the closing hymn or song, and they all parade themselves back out. Heaven processes down from the altar, in and through the people, in and through the space that represents all earthly reality once more. It's come and gone. There's like an ebb and a flow to it, right? So what else can we say about all of this movement within this sacred space? Like a lot. Too much for what we can do here. So let's just spotlight some of the biggest insights that we can glean from all of this. Just by meditating on the altar party and their simple movements, you will see that what they are doing, what they are depicting symbolically, is meant to be embodied by everybody who is participating in that service. These processions teach us that human beings, yes, real human beings like you and me, we straddle two different realities. And it's the altar party's movement through the space, movement between the heavenly reality and the earthly reality that we are meant to embody as well. It's their movement that overcomes the duality between these realities. The altar party teaches us that human beings are not meant to just sit in the pews of earthly existence, but we are also meant to serve at the altar of heavenly existence. Both realities are important, and we can only discover the essence of who we are by overcoming the duality between them within us. We are to find the heaven in the center of our earthliness, and our world in the center of that which is divine. Another point that is very significant that is often overlooked is that the cross leads the whole parade. It is through the cross, it is through Jesus' sacrifice, it is through this symbol of suffering that earthly existence enters into the heavenly realm. But it's also through Jesus' sacrifice and this symbol of suffering that heaven has entered into our earthly realm. Both realities participate in one another through the cross. Whenever I went to seminary, I was taught, and this idea has been echoed by like every Episcopal church that I've ever been to since, that the person at the back of the procession, at the back of the parade, is supposed to be the person with the most honorable title and respectable title, position, if you will. They're the highest in the churchy hierarchy, if you will. So this is the reason why the priest or the bishop are the last in line. They carry the most weight of authority within our tradition. Side note, The Last in Line is a great song by Ronnie James Dio, by the way. Epic song. I digress yet again. Back to it. But I happen to think that the person leading the parade, the person carrying that cross, is the most important person in the procession. Not because of who they are, but because of the cross they bear. And the torchbearers likewise are also just as important. In their symbolic action, they teach us that by gazing upon the cross, by meditating on it, we will be illumined, enlightened. For Jesus' death on the cross is the greatest moment of non-duality in all of human history. On the cross, God entered into human suffering. On the cross, human suffering entered into God. Jesus didn't just die to appease the wrath. He didn't die to appease the wrath of an angry God, to pacify the anger of a ticked-off Father in heaven. No, through the cross, Jesus entered into every tear, every heartache, every ounce of suffering that human beings have ever felt and ever will feel. Through Jesus, the divine suffered in our suffering. The point of the cross is not that Jesus suffered in a unique way. No, the point of the cross is that Jesus suffered in every single way that we do. The point of the cross is that the divine suffers. The cross was the portal through which God entered into all of your agony. The cross which Christ bore upon his shoulders was your cross, was your suffering. Meditate on this processional. It's not empty ritualism, my friends. Meditate on it. Meditate on that cross as it enters into the sanctuary, and you will see this symbol of so much suffering going from the earthly realm up into the heavenly realm, up into the Holy of Holies, entering into the space that depicts heaven itself. Because of Jesus' sacrifice, human suffering has now become heavenized, sanctified, redeemed. The point? No matter who you are or what you've been through, you're not alone. You've never been alone, and you never will be alone in your agony, in your suffering. You may feel like nobody knows what you're going through. That might be true, but there is one who does. For the last 2,000 years, you have not been alone. 2,000 years ago, there was one who entered into everything you have felt. In every tear, in every pain, in every season of despair or depression, in every ounce of sadness, in every suicidal or hopeless, God-forsaken thought, God has been right there with you, not just watching you from afar, but suffering through all of these things with you. The deepest form of empathy imaginable, beyond imagination even. There is no duality between your pain and God's pain. The veil between heaven and earth has never been thinner than those seasons of life where you feel like everything is going to shit. Everything is going to hell. Through the cross, your suffering has become sacramentalized. God is just as present to you through your suffering as he is to you through bread and wine. That is the meaning of the cross. So the crucifer has it right whenever she lifts high the cross. And the torchbearers have it right whenever they illuminate the cross with their tiny torches. Because the cross is non-duality. For it teaches us that we are never more immersed in God's presence than those times in life when we feel most God-forsaken. We are never nearer to God and God to us than those seasons where we suffer. Just we take so little time to notice it. The procession begins with a crucifer, but it ends with a priest. Meaning that it begins with a cross, but it ends with a heavenized universe. It begins with someone bearing a symbol of suffering, but it ends with someone bearing symbolic garments that depict just how much the barrier between heaven and earth has been overcome. So what's the simple takeaway point from this whole talk? I could say this after every talk, I think. The simple takeaway point: if there's anything stirring up in here right now, you won't really get any of this, intuit any of this from your couch or your bed on Sunday mornings. You have to show up to the liturgy. You have to meditate. You have to do the work. You have to participate in the work of the people. Then, after years of meditating on that sacred space, you see that it's not so much a symbol of heaven and earth outside of you, as much as it is a symbol of the heaven and earth within you. The sanctuary and the layout is a map of your own soul. And you will come to realize also, after years of meditating on the procession, that there is no duality between the altar party's journey in the procession and your soul's journey through this life. Thanks for tuning in. Peace be with you.